Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to At Family Office, Family Office TV, and for my members of my private club, SFO Continuity, welcome, where you have an opportunity for interaction, earlier access, and favorable introductions to our amazing speakers as well. I hope you're all doing well. This is my first of 2 live sessions this week. It's been a busy, busy time coming off the summer. I hope many of you, and if you haven't, I'm putting it up in my public platforms for at least a little while. My interview with David Hunter, who's a pretty iconic macro strategist over 53 years. So far this year, it's my most downloaded of my videos. It's long form, and it was a lot of fun. So again, David Hunter, if you haven't seen it, go and enjoy it. But today, I think I really have something special for you. How about a Y Combinator entrepreneur reinventing the real estate industry? So join me for today's exclusive digital live, for those of you that are live, online event featuring Jerry Chu, CEO of Lofty AI, and like I mentioned, the Y Combinator alum. And we're going to get to some of that in our questioning as he reveals how his platform is reinventing real estate investing through blockchain, DAOs, and effectively fractional ownership. If you're ready to explore the cutting edge world of tokenization, real estate, and how DAOs are changing property management and ownership, then this is for you. I've been talking about this for years, but many of you just in the family office world never quite got on board. But now we're at a point where it's growing in popularity. Massive institutions like BlackRock are obviously heavy involved in Bitcoin and a lot of the things happening in the Web3 ecosystem. And there's no question, especially with integration through AI, that what we're talking about today is going to be the future of real assets and a lot of things as we know it. So for a family office to get a little bit of a head start and learn, how does Lofty offer instant liquidity in real estate transactions? What role does blockchain play in ensuring transparency and security? Why DAOs are the future of real estate and perhaps other operations and investing? And what's the vision for Lofty and why institutional investors, including even family offices, should care? So this will be a very special session. And after my overly long-winded build-up, but well-earned, Jerry, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure. So my audience knows I'm fascinated by a couple of things before we even get to the core of you being an entrepreneur and what you're doing. And that basically is, I love entrepreneurship. It's the spirit of America and of course others around the world. And you were part of not only launching kind of a high-tech, unique company in the field that was rapidly evolving in the last couple of years, but you went through the most iconic, I guess, incubator platform in the world, Y Combinator. I'd love to hear a little bit of your journey to be an entrepreneur, why Lofty, and how you got the attention of Y Combinator.
Yeah. I went to school for math and economics for my bachelor's degree. I also have a master's degree in financial engineering. So that's all to gear up to say, I've been a pretty technical guy, pretty deep in math and sciences my whole life. And I had sort of built my career around trying to sort of be a quant trader on Wall Street. It's just something I thought I wanted to do. I was good with numbers. And I had the opportunity to work there, for a brief period. And it's one of those things, it's kind of like, don't meet your hero. It turns out, there's a lot of bureaucracy.
Unless you're meeting Jim Simons, then it's okay to be that.
And it's different. But, at least where I was, there was a ton of sort of big corporate bureaucracy and just things that made me realize I didn't want to make a sort of 30, 40-year career out of this. And so I had always been interested in tech. So I decided to teach myself how to code and sort of pivot into the technology field, where I went to work at another startup in Los Angeles, and it's where I met my co-founder, one of them, Max. He was also working at this company at the time. And personally for me, my father's an entrepreneur. So I think growing up, you're actually, whether you like it or not, you're often subconsciously affected by your parents and people in your network. And so seeing my father do his own business, I guess I just always wanted to start something myself as well. And it just got to a point where I kind of thought, hey, instead of waiting for the best time, I think the best time might just be now. I'm young. I don't have a lot of responsibilities, no mortgage, no wife or kids at the time. So it seems like, hey, if I'm going to do something crazy and very risky, this is actually probably the smartest time to do it. So one day I was working on a pitch deck I had for an idea. And that idea was basically, kind of inspired by quant trading, which is in real estate, people actually don't leverage data to the degree that they probably should. And my idea was that you had all this real-time geotagged information, like people sharing stuff on Twitter, now X, Instagram posts and things like that, Yelp reviews, whatever the case may be. And you can essentially build a model that would ingest data like this, and it would kind of predict which neighborhoods you should invest in before they gentrify or before they become quote unquote up and coming, right? And the idea was you would then see a much higher rate of appreciation than you previously would see without having that insight. And I thought real estate investors would, pay to get this insight. So that was the idea. And I was working on a pitch deck at work one day, and Max kind of just scooted over, and I was like, "Oh, what's that you're working on?" And we just got to chatting about this idea. And, it was a little surprising to me, but he got very excited, and we just talked about it for 4 hours that day, I think. And as crazy as it sounds, the next week we quit our jobs together to start Lofty in, what its first iteration was. And that was actually the idea and business model we took to Y Combinator as well. We just applied like everyone else. And, for one reason or another, the partners there thought what we were working on was interesting enough and had potential to become a pretty big platform one day. And we interviewed, and we actually didn't get in the first time we interviewed, but they came back to us and said, "Hey, we really liked you guys. We actually didn't like the idea that much, so if you have any other ideas, you can pitch us those ideas instead, and maybe we'll let you in the batch." We ended up kind of sticking with our idea and just kept working on it instead of doing that. But I guess we got enough traction with that idea and had enough, market proof from early customers that when we applied the second time around, there was a very clear, noticeable difference in traction, right? First time, had one customer didn't really have an idea of what we were building or doing yet. Second time around, I think we were up to 5 to 10 customers. And at that point, we were selling to, large institutional real estate folks. And so we had some pretty big names in our roster of customers and really kind of understood them a lot more at that point. And so the interview just went a lot better the second time. So we ended up getting into their summer of 2019 batch. Just went through the program like that. So that was kind of our journey of how I founded Lofty, how I met my co-founder, and ultimately getting through Y Combinator.
I think that's fantastic. And today's conversation is going to be partially about resilience, about entrepreneurship, a little bit of Y Combinator, some of the VC community, and really a lot about what a lot of you, I think, should at minimal learn more about, which is a little bit the world of Web3 and DAOs and how it's intertwining with real world assets that many of you own, like real estate, and basically how things are changing. Before we start to progress to that, you did say a couple of things that are of great interest to me. And in some of the consulting work I do with families, shockingly for an old grouchy guy like me, I actually often end up working with the rising generation and intertwining the engagement with the quote unquote elders. So a question I do have for you is probably the number one concern of a lot of families of great wealth is effectively their children, that they have gumption, that they have resiliency, that they are able to spark ideas and go off on their own. And maybe that's in education, maybe it's philanthropy, maybe it's art, maybe it's whatever they want, but to find an inner purpose and satisfaction. I agree with you. Entrepreneurship by following a parent's footstep probably helps. What would you say is what you learn the most in your formative years? What a lot of outsiders don't understand is, oh, I'm sure Jerry grew up in a very, very wealthy family and his father or mother poured a gazillion dollars into their enterprises. I rarely find that to be true. What was the non-financial value that you got from your parents and maybe others in your friends' ecosystem of understanding entrepreneurship and having to put in the grind and do the work?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think I was just very fortunate in my life where, um, I'm kind of lucky enough to straddle both sides of basically two different worlds, which is I was actually born very poor in, communist China, essentially in the early 90s, when they still had the one child policy, everything. My parents did not have a lot of money. And at that point, the way they explained it to me was there was so little freedom at that point that people didn't really pick their own careers. Like you would go to school, you would go to university, and each university was specialized to do something. So if you went to like the University of like petroleum engineering, like that's your job. Like you don't get to afterwards decide like, oh, I'm gonna go do something else and not be a petroleum engineer. Like no, that basically determines your life trajectory and career. And in many cases, when you graduate, like the teachers or professors or the school would actually pick your careers for you. Like, oh, based on what we know about you and your test scores and things like that, we think you should go do it and be X. And if I recall, they actually wanted my dad to go be a professor. That was kind of what they picked for him, and he decided that he didn't want to do that, and just ended up not doing that. And so it was kind of very much of bucking the trend. He really didn't have any options after that. And so just ended up starting his own thing because in that sort of system that you grow up in, if you sort of rebel and do something outside the norm, that kind of ends up being your only option. But he was fortunate in that was also like the perfect timing, right when China was opening up to the rest of the world, and especially the West, for direct foreign investments. That's when a lot of those special economic zones got created of cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, things like that, and they became powerful economic houses, all the way up till today. And so he was kind of at the right place at the right time, and it just kind of worked out for him. But again, growing up, there were moments where I think he only had 1 month of rent available. So like he didn't have money if that month, at the end of that month, if he didn't figure out a way to get more money, we would just not be able to pay. There were situations where I think he had to borrow money to start his own business. And at that time, China did not have a very robust credit system. So you couldn't really just walk into a bank and get a loan. There certainly were no VCs or anything like that. And so he had to like borrow money from like loan sharks and people. And so, they would like, I remember there was a case where they kind of hid me with my grandparents in a room. It's like, oh yeah, don't go outside. Like your dad's busy with his friends. In hindsight, like they weren't his friends. They were basically like the loan sharks coming to basically threaten him. Like, if you don't pay us back, we're going to kick your ass right now. So I kind of grew up in that environment, but my dad's business ended up taking off and doing quite well by the time I was in, middle school, high school. And at that point, when I was 6 years old, we immigrated to Canada. So I actually grew up in Vancouver. And so at that point, we started, becoming wealthier and living in a nice house, having nice cars. So I'm just one of those rare people that simultaneously in his sort of early formative years, both been really poor and also become sort of upper middle class, like, more wealthier. And so that's really helped inform me of a lot of my worldviews and sort of ability to recognize opportunities. I think one of the biggest factors for people who grow up too comfortably is that they never have any problems in life, right? And if you don't have any problems, then you can't think of ways to solve them for other people. And so that's why you end up not having a lot of great ideas. But for me, growing up and kind of experiencing all the different things of, lower class that had to go through, middle class people had to go through, like upper middle class people have to go through, I sort of saw like all these different problems that different people were facing. And having experienced that just made me a lot more confident about entrepreneurship, of like, there's all these different things you could solve for other people. And if you're able to do them well, then of course there's going to be a market and people will pay you for it. So that simultaneously kind of gave me enough insight, but also the confidence to pursue these things.
That's wonderful. And a common trend there that I found among others as well. And simply just let me know if you agree. I think it was evident in your father and in yourself. And that's what I call comfort in the thicket of ambiguity. You can't always have certainty, a little bit like playing poker. You want to understand the math and the game and the rules, but there is going to be a little bit of an element of luck, a little bit of an element of emotional intelligence, and that you have to make decisions, sometimes quick decisions, without ever having 100% of the facts that you want. If you're waiting for that perfect time, you're waiting for your teeth to be able to bite, you're going to end up waiting decades. You're not going to have any teeth left to take a bite out of an apple from. Yeah. So I think that's a wonderful lesson that you've learned, and I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm very thankful for my upbringing and these sort of opportunities, which, at the time, most people wouldn't realize it's a blessing, but in hindsight, it was.
Of course. So in Y Combinator, you had the opportunity to be somewhat thrown to the wolves. You're meeting fellow entrepreneurs that are probably, no offense, and I would say the same that they're talking about you, equally as smart, as talented. Their idea, I'm assuming, of course, is different. And you're also swimming in the sharks of the world of angel and VCs. How did you learn how to grow up and navigate all of that with both peers, competitors, and those that you're effectively looking to get money from?
Yeah, great question. And I would argue, when you get into Y Combinator, it definitely felt like we were the dumbest people in the room, like by a mile. Because you would just meet such incredibly smart and talented people, like truly raw talent. Like you would meet people who were like, oh yeah, I built like a robot in my basement, like when I was 15 years old. Like you would meet that caliber of people. Just like, that's not what a normal person does, right? So it definitely was quite intimidating. But one of the great things is that, at least in my experience, everyone was also extremely humble and extremely accessible. Like if you had questions about robotics and you didn't know anything about it, you didn't come from that background, people were extremely patient and happy to chat with you and kind of sort of teach you about what they know and sort of discuss insights. And so I think more than the education itself, that's probably one of the biggest things that sets YC apart, which is the caliber of people that they let into the program and their behavior towards each other. Even today, which kind of answers the second question you asked, how to navigate the VC world and investors. The majority of the funding we were able to raise was because of warm introductions from, YC people in that ecosystem. Not even just from the batch that I was in, but even today, if I were to just go on my email and send a couple emails out to YC alums that I've never met before, like shockingly, nearly 100% of them would respond and probably introduce me to people. So that's definitely something that was extremely helpful and is a big value proposition for going through YC. And then, in addition to kind of having that strong network for warm introductions, which really does make things a lot easier, because you just get your foot in the door so much easier. You sort of bypass all the cold outreach, the analysts, the associates. You're able to directly, in many cases, talk to the general partner at the VC fund, or literally one of the founders at the fund. So that certainly makes things a lot easier. But the only other thing that kind of helped us was just practice over time. Like I don't think there was really a shortcut. YC does teach you certain things to say, or how to sort of navigate the VC world, because there's a lot of things that are unsaid, if you will, right? Like you just sort of understand how the game is played. And so if you're a little naive and you don't understand the rules, you can go into certain meetings and be like, oh, well, but they said this, but secretly it didn't actually mean that. You kind of have to understand the meaning behind it. So YC certainly helps us by coaching us and kind of teaching us all those insights. But beyond that, literally the only thing that helps is just repeatedly refining your pitch. So you would pitch the first investor, and in many cases you would suck and it would be terrible. They barely understood what you were trying to build. But hopefully you take something away from that experience. And then when you pitch the second one and then the third one and so on and so forth, you just start getting better and better. You start, looking at people's facial reactions and the questions that they ask. You start to understand what resonates with people, how you say something, what you say it, when you say it. And you just start to sort of just develop this intuition. And I would say at this point, I probably pitched over 120 investors, and it's just a numbers game. The vast majority will say no, as it is with it's kind of like a sales process, if you will, and you just kind of have to truck through it. And almost all the successful YC founders I know, when they were doing it for the first time, it's the same thing. It's just rejection after rejection. Even the ones you read where it says, hey, XYZ company raised a massive amount of money in their, Series A round or whatever is the case. Behind the scenes, if you talk to the founder, a lot of times like, oh yeah, that took me 8 months and I had like 200 meetings and 190 something said no. And like shockingly, this one fund said yes. And then once they said yes, everyone else got really excited and we closed around that way. So that's kind of just the nature of the game.
Yeah, the ability to iterate, to be resilient, to listen, to adapt. And you mentioned the really smart, like the kid, quote unquote, that designed the robot probably has a wickedly high IQ. But if they're not able to some degree, communication, salesmanship, understanding the process, investors, and it's not just coming up with the idea, it's the ability to execute on it, which is why multiple founders in the realm and the world of Silicon Valley and what you're in, that each bring a different skill set, commonly among 3 or more, is often a really good mixture. So in the future, we may have a bit of a deeper time to dive into that, but I wanted to at least spend part of today's discussion understanding the mindset and the traits and some of your process. Now let's go a little bit more forward. A lot of my audience may not be as familiar. They probably heard of, I've heard about this thing called fractionalization, tokenization, something in the blockchain, maybe DAOs. We're not going to do a deep down the rabbit hole, but we have to give a little bit of a foundation about what some of those terminologies mean, I think, before we get to what you're doing or in coordination with it. How would you describe, and all evolving relatively in the last couple of years, what is meant by the tokenization of a real world asset, and why does the terminology DAO, DAO, and what that stands for and why that's important, along with the blockchain? So I'm trying to make it simple, but the reality is it's not always so easy.
Yeah. So essentially, the idea of tokenization is just that, specifically relating to real estate and how it works, here in the United States and most of the Western world, is that ownership is sort of recognized and recorded by the government, right? So when you legally own a property, you don't even have to physically be there or residing in it. The government recognizes this deed, which says you're the legal owner. And so therefore you own the property, right? And the problem with that is, you have all these middlemen, you involve title companies and so on. And when you do a transfer or transaction, it's very complicated. It's a very manual work, a lot of paperwork, and then you send that off to the counties, and they manually record it. And that could take, fairly, that depends. Sometimes they're backlog, like the county doesn't record it for months at a time, right? So it's this really sort of high friction manual process. And when you combine that, it just ends up taking a really long time for real estate to legally transfer ownership, right? And the problem with that is it creates illiquidity in the market. If it's really difficult and takes a really long time for the ownership of a property to transfer, it makes it so that it's just impossible to trade that asset and create the same level of liquidity and transaction speed as, for example, stocks on the stock market, right? Or cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin and Ethereum. So that's one of the main reasons why sort of real estate has never been able to upgrade itself relative to other asset classes like stocks, bonds, and cryptocurrencies. So the idea of tokenization is basically, what if you could upgrade real estate? What if you could make the legal ownership or the recording of the asset happen, within milliseconds or within 1 or 2 seconds on this digital network, right? Essentially just like on the internet. If you're able to achieve that, then the idea is basically anyone can come and build a platform, build a system where you can, like, let's say you're on Zillow and you're browsing a house and you have the money, you looked at it and you're like, hey, I like this property. You went and you toured it and you're like, hey, I really want to buy this house. It creates the ability for you to just click a button and sign some stuff online digitally and pay the money digitally. And now instantly you're the owner of the property. You don't have to wait 3 months for any recordings. You don't have to go through middlemen, third parties, or anything like that. Just instant transactions. And if you're able to do that, then the idea is basically you could all of a sudden, for a traditional liquid asset class, inject a lot more liquidity, a lot more transparency around price discovery and things like that. So you basically sort of level up real estate to the point where it's extremely similar to stocks. And that's basically the idea behind tokenization.
Okay, that takes care of tokenization. Where does a DAO, and specifically here in the US, Wyoming, and why Wyoming, how does that interplay?
Yeah. So, the idea of a DAO, you don't have to use a DAO for any of this stuff. Realistically speaking, it could be any LLCs. And, a lot of our competitors and just other people in this space use traditional member managed LLCs. So that's totally doable. For us specifically, and why we use DAOs, again, a lot of it just ended up being good timing as well. We were looking for a mechanism because, what we're building is essentially a marketplace where we're trying to build the world's first digital real estate exchange. And we just want to build a technology. So we don't want to run a fund. We don't want to manage assets for users and other people. So the idea is that, people would manage and self-manage their own properties, just like how they do now in the traditional real estate market. But they need a mechanism to do that. If we were to create these LLCs and tokenize properties for them in the traditional sense, these LLCs require a legal manager on paper. So, either it's a manager managed LLC or it's a member managed LLC. But even for a member managed LLC, you technically still need someone to sign and be quote unquote the manager. And that creates a problem for us around regulations and securities laws, right? We don't want to be in charge. We don't want to be that manager. We don't want to do any of that stuff. And so coincidentally, at the time when we were sort of exploring this problem, Wyoming actually came out with a new set of laws that created a new type of LLC known as a DAO LLC. And a lot of people might actually be surprised to hear, but Wyoming is quite innovative around sort of legal entities and structures.
It's my part-time home. Yeah. I do understand.
Yeah. LLCs themselves, I think, were actually invented originally in Wyoming.
That is correct. I believe 1979, if I have that correct.
Exactly. So they've been like very innovative in this. So that came out and we took a look at it. And so a DAO LLC is very unique in that a lot of it is very traditional, just like a normal LLC. So it gives you the same legal rights. It's able to have a tax ID with the IRS. It can pay taxes. It can legally own property, right? So that's really important. It can actually own the deed to a real estate or any other property. The only difference between a DAO LLC and a traditional LLC is that legally on paper, a DAO LLC doesn't need to have a human or any entity as a manager. Instead, it's allowed to be algorithmically managed, meaning that it is managed by a smart contract on the blockchain. So in our case, the smart contract is basically a voting mechanism that we've designed so that any person who becomes an owner or buys interests, right, or shares in these LLC are given these shares as digital tokens. And using these digital tokens, they can vote on basically anything relating to the operations of this DAO LLC and to enact sort of new rules within the system. And that makes it so that it's an incredibly fair and democratic way for multiple people to be owners of the same entity, sometimes without knowing each other, and as simultaneously allowing us to remove ourselves as managers of these entities. So that's ultimately the difference in how DAO LLCs work and why we chose to use those.
And the intertwining of tokenization, which I'm assuming is not theoretically possible without blockchain and smart contracts, coupled with DAOs as effectively, let's go with the word, a governance mechanism. That combination, loosely defined as Web3, which again is going to be newer over the last 5 years to a lot of people, at least that combination. On the surface, I think people broadly get it, but I think there's going to be some concern with it sounds a little complicated. Why don't we dive a little deeper for those that may have a property that they may want to, let's go with the word list, or sell fractional ownership of, comparative to those that may want to purchase fractional interest in quote unquote real estate and receive some of that income, that they do not need to be a Web3 crypto guru. Explain how you built the platform where basically, even if you know practically nothing about that, it still is going to be easy.
Yeah, absolutely. So we built that very intentionally on our end. We knew our end, customers, many of them are going to be from the real estate industry and might not really understand or trust blockchain or cryptocurrencies or anything like that. And so we build a platform in a way where you quite literally can know like absolutely nothing about blockchain, and it would just still function just like a normal, product that you're used to using. So the way this all works legally and technologically is actually very simple. So basically every DAO, which is an LLC, right, and can legally own property, will hold the deed to the underlying property, and it will only own one property. So every DAO owns one property, right?
Exactly.
So the deed of the property is legally, and you can search it up on the county records, owned by this DAO LLC. And what actually happens is the property itself never changes hand. Is the ownership of the DAO that changes hands. So imagine, you want to invest with your friends or family members, right? And you say, hey, we're going to buy a house together. But instead of having, 3 or 4 people on the deed, which is cumbersome, like what if one of you wants to be bought out, or, someone finds a new investor and they want to be bought out in that way, and also liability protection, right? Like instead of having it under your personal names, a lot of times what people do, and this is extremely common in the real estate world, is you would just form an LLC, and then, you and your friends or family members would just become members of this LLC together and use this LLC to invest and buy the property. So in this case, it's identical. It's basically the exact same thing, right? And so by nature, if you own, 10% of this LLC, which only has one asset, which is the underlying property, then by proxy, you own 10% of the property, of its equity, any, future income, current earnings, things like that. So that's legally how all of this is structured. But traditional LLC interests are physical paper, right? They're legal contract. They're not very liquid and they're hard to transact. So, let's say you owned a property with, your family members, and you say, hey, I own 10% of this, but I need some liquidity. I decided I want to cash out, right? And your family members are okay with that. They're like, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. You find me as the buyer. Now we want to do a transaction. This is where it gets really annoying and cumbersome, right? Like imagine if we're in different states, right? And like, you're like, oh, like here, my lawyer drafted up this complicated contract, send it, your lawyer has to review, and it just becomes this really complicated thing where it's costly for everyone, both in sort of time and actual money required. And because of those two factors, again, this is sort of why there's a lack of liquidity. It's very difficult for you to buy and sell partial ownership of an LLC. So what we've done is essentially by tokenizing the interests of these LLCs into tokens that can move freely on the blockchain, you can just come to our platform and say, hey, I have 10% of this LLC which owns this property. I am going to sell 10%. And you just list these shares as tokens for sale. And then you go out and you have lunch. And when that happens, our platform has, buyers from all around the world who will come and look at a property, same thing as a traditional real estate investor, and do their own diligence. They'll research address. They will look at rent rolls. They will look at neighborhoods, school ratings sometimes, right? Again, these are mostly single family properties used as rentals or Airbnbs. So they'll look at all of these things that they typically look at. And let's say they get comfortable and they're like, hey, yeah, I want to invest in this property. I like this cash flow profile and future growth potentials. Then they can just on their end, using credit cards, ACH bank transfers, and cryptocurrencies if they want to, right? But you're not forced to use it. They can just buy your 10%. And so you go out for lunch, you come back home and you just look at your account like, oh, I've sold my interest in this LLC. I'm no longer the owner and they're now the owner. And I can cash out and take my money and we can send that to your bank account. So that's essentially how all of this build from a technology standpoint. Underneath the hood, there are smart contracts involved. all these transactions settle as stable coins, right? Dollar denominated stable coins. So in this case, we use USDC from Circle and Coinbase. And on top of that, you're actually using self-custodial wallets. But we've abstracted away all that stuff. So when you come to the website, you just have a Lofty account. Your account is actually connected to a wallet. And when you're buying and selling things and you're clicking, hey, I agree to this agreement, and I read this contract, I agree with it, you're actually signing a lot of things using your digital wallet, and these records become permanently recorded on the blockchain. But you don't need to do anything because we've already built that in for you. So you don't need to understand how wallets work. You don't need to understand how signing through that smart contract works. You just click buttons in a traditional sort of Web 2, website experience. You're like, okay, yes, I want to buy this. Yes, I want to sell that. I want to buy this at this price. I want to sell it at that price. So very, easy to understand user interface that anyone can touch. And so, at the end of the day, you don't really need to understand blockchain or cryptocurrencies.
Yes, and that ease of use, I think, is going to be very important. And for the audience that thinks like this is the future of real world assets, to ignore it is not going to make it go away. It's going to make you outdated in a lot of how things are changing in the world of investing, institutional investing, ironically, partially led by BlackRock, and that'll be advancing as the days, months, and years go on. Mm-hmm. You have to learn this, and these guys and others, it's going to get easier and easier as we are describing now. Not to get too deep into the weeds, but if it's on a blockchain, I guess the question from my perspective, who dabbles in Web3, is what blockchain, and explain to me why, even if something terrible were to happen to that blockchain, why there is actually an answer and a solution for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of times people get confused and get caught up with the idea of a blockchain. It's this really complicated and mathematically, complex sort of algorithm that governs the whole thing. But at the end of the day, you can sort of think of the blockchain as just a database, just like any other database that companies use. And every product you use, whether that's Uber, you order food from DoorDash, you buy airline tickets online, whatever the case may be, those companies record and settle these transactions in essentially a database. It's just that the majority of the time they're using a private database monitored and controlled by the company, right? And so
centralized would be another word.
Exactly. And so, for example, if the airline makes a mistake and something happens in their database and they claim you didn't buy the ticket, from their end, it's just like, you didn't buy the ticket. And a lot of times, it's very hard for you to prove that you're in fact right and the company is in fact wrong. So the blockchain is essentially just another database, but it's publicly available and it's decentralized. So no one entity or one party or one person controls it. And all the records are publicly available. So if you make a transaction, right, that is settled on the blockchain, you'll be able to track it and pinpoint to it and be like, hey, at this specific date and time, I paid you X dollars. And you can see that live on the blockchain, through an Explorer. And so if someone then claims like, oh, well, our records show that we didn't receive it, you can be like, no, you're incorrect. You can see the status. This went through. This is your wallet. Do you accept that this is, in fact, your wallet address? If so, then you definitely received it, right? So that's sort of the power of the blockchain, where anyone can come and verify records. And that's why it's, a lot of our early adopters really liked it, because what we were trying to build sounded a little too good to be true and a little crazy, to the point that they wanted to be able to, verify records on their own, to be like, okay, this company is actually legitimate. They claim this is what's happening. I can verify and confirm that that's in fact what's happening. So that's one of the huge advantages of blockchain. And so, essentially we use a blockchain called Algorand. And it's not a super common one that everyone hears about, but it's really useful for us because it can handle a large number of transactions per second, and it settles transactions very quickly. So there's this idea where, when you make a transaction on a blockchain, when you initiate the transaction and when it ultimately settles are often two very different things. And depending on the blockchain, that time could be very variable, right? So same idea, like if you have a merchant account with fiat rails like MasterCard and, credit cards and things like that, when your customer pays you, you don't get the money in your bank account right away. It goes through the network and is usually held by your payment merchant for a number of days before they release in your bank.
God forbid it's the weekend.
Exactly. And so that's the difference between the transaction, initiating the transaction, and the settlement, right? There's a big gap. And so cryptocurrencies or the blockchain is very interesting. It's sort of like doing a cash transaction where one hand you're giving someone the cash, and then the other hand you're literally receiving the product. It essentially settles instantaneously, but now you do it in a digital way, so you don't have to be face to face with the person you're transacting with, and that's really powerful. And so the chain we use, Algorand, basically the moment you click a button and you initiate a transaction, in about 2 seconds it'll settle, meaning you'll actually receive the money or whatever the item you bought into your wallet, right? So you know for a fact, like, hey, I own this now. It's like a cash transaction. I received the physical product, right? And it's incredibly cheap. So there's some blockchains where, if you try to send $50 equivalent of assets, you might cost you like $4 or $5, right?
Yeah, that's all gas fees, like Ethereum.
Exactly. So you basically have to pay these fees to send transactions and to use the blockchain. So Algorand, the gas fees are incredibly cheap. They are essentially fractions of a single penny. So you could send 100, sometimes more than 100 transactions, and it will cost you, 1 penny, right? In terms of US dollars. So it's incredibly effective for us. And that's one of the reasons why our users don't have to worry about knowing, understanding blockchain or cryptocurrencies, because we cover their transaction fees for them. And we're able to do that because it's so cheap on this blockchain. So you don't need to come and bring your own gas fees or anything like that. So this is kind of why we use the blockchain, why we use Algorand specifically. And then, the one beneficial thing is, in addition to running a lot of these transactions directly on the blockchain, we actually do maintain a secondary record, our own centralized private database, right? And so in the event, let's say, there's multiple blockchains, but let's say for whatever reason, the future of Algorand does not look bright, or the chain's going to shut down at some point, it's actually trivially easy for us to just migrate everything, all the histories, all the settlements, all the previous transactions, all the existing records of who holds what and owns what, and just move that onto a different blockchain. And so that's why, it's very safe for our end users, because there's essentially a fail-safe set of record keeping as well.
And rather bluntly, Jerry,
okay to be on the blockchain.
How about the opposite? No offense. I hope you become a billionaire and form a single family office and come to me to help you. But just in case something doesn't work out at Lofty, what happens to my investments on the blockchain? What would happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And so nothing would happen. And that's the beauty of
Exactly.
the platform, which is, it's also another reason why we've decided to use the blockchain, which is, these are assets you own. We can't take them back from you once a transaction settles. In fact, when you're buying and selling stuff directly on our platform, you're never actually trading with us. We're not your counterparty. We just maintain the marketplace that connects buyers and sellers. So when you buy real estate on Lofty, you're just directly buying it from another person, from a seller, right? And when you sell something and it goes through and someone else is buying it, it's just another person. So all of these transactions happen peer to peer. They go from your wallet, your account, to the other person's wallet and their account. The money never passes through, our bank, never goes through our company, never goes through our wallets. And so if we were, unfortunately, let's say it were to happen, I don't think it would, but if it did, and Lofty weren't around anymore, all your assets would still be in your wallets, which you have full control over, and you can, still move these assets around. And it's actually all the smart contracts we deploy to date that enables these transactions all exist. They can't shut down even if we want them to. And so what ends up happening is someone else, and a lot of our users are quite technical, can trivially spin up a front end user interface, and basically trading can happen again. You can connect all the buyers and sellers through these smart contracts again. And so really what we're building towards is that as a business, we're essentially obsolete. You don't really need us to be in the middle, but for most people, you'll enjoy us because we're going to try to build you the best user experience, the best looking platform, that's performant, and you'll enjoy using it. But in theory, someone else could come and build a platform on top of all these smart contracts and assets as well. And we can't really stop them. And if we were to, not exist anymore, it leaves a room for someone else to just open something else up, and your assets would still be safe. You can still resume trading. You'll still have liquidity. So none of that really gets affected by, progress of what happens business-wise at Lofty.
And Jerry, walk me through. Say that I go on the platform, I register, I transfer whatever, 50,000 via NACH. I'm looking up mainly single family homes, whatever owner occupied, rented. You mentioned some Airbnb. I get an idea for the home, the neighborhood, the math behind it, including in this example, say rental or Airbnb income. And I want to diversify. I want to put 10 investments to work, $5,000 each, my quote unquote, my 50,000. I think you pretty much already explained it's practically about as easy can get. But now, how does that work? Meaning, assuming all 10 properties are kicking off income, and I don't know, I'll make the math easy. My investment in it is 3%. Am I entitled to then 3% of the cash flow?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And so every DAO LLC actually has their own bank account that's under the DAO's name, not under our names, not under any individual user's name. And the tenants actually pay traditionally still the rental income into the bank account, right? So they're paying, through property management portals and things like that. So it's actually very traditional in that sense. We've just built it so that these banks have APIs that we can use, that our platform can connect to, so that, these rent that you're entitled to, let's say you own 3% of the property, you're entitled to 3% of the rents. And we actually pay out these rental income on a daily basis. So you'll see it accruing in your account. And should you decide to then say, okay, I want to withdraw this, income now into my bank account so I can use it. When you click a button to say withdraw, it fires off all these API connections to all the different DAO's bank accounts and verifies that you are, in fact, based on your token ownership, 3% owner of this property. And it will only allow you to withdraw 3% of the income in the bank account. And it will not let you touch other people's money, essentially, right? And so this is a way that we enable all of this to work. And that money is then directly sent to your bank account. So that's how it works. Or you could keep the money on the platform and say, when you go reinvest in a property you really like, or there's a new listing that you want to buy, you can reuse your rental income that you've accrued as, a sort of a credit to, for your new purchase. So you can continuously increase your portfolio size in a very easy way.
And what happens when, I don't know, there's a majority owner of whatever 50.1% and they want to sell? How is that handled?
Yeah, so everything goes through a voting system. We don't use simple majorities in these DAOs, right? These DAOs require a supermajority of 60% for any decisions to be enacted. And there are actually limits on how much of the DAO one individual person can own, up to a certain amount, to keep voting and governance really fair. And so that's typically at 15%, right? So, it's actually impossible for one person to have over 51% of the votes, or to reach supermajority on their own. It's just designed to not be possible. And so it's a very democratic process. And should you, or any owners, like even if you own just one token and you own 0.001% of a property, you're, as a legal owner, entitled to propose your votes to other owners. So what you'll do is actually do what's called a governance proposal, where you'll write out sort of your train of thoughts and logic, like, hey guys, I think this might be a really good market to sell, like, whatever. You can have some analysis around interest rates, maybe like, hey, if we don't do it now, I think we're going to miss a great opportunity. And you basically send all of these through our platform over to every other owner of that property, and they'll read your proposal, and then they can vote on it and say like, yeah, I agree, this makes a ton of sense, I want to do what this person's proposing. Or they say, no, I don't want to do that doesn't seem right to me. And the results will be tallied up. Again, this is all recorded on the blockchain, so you get to see the wallet addresses. So it's anonymous. People don't know who you are or how you voted, because your name isn't attached to the wallet. But people can verify like, hey, these number of wallets voted, and you can check to see what assets these wallets were holding at the time of their vote to know like, hey, they're actually legally an owner. And then you can in fact check the results is correct. But essentially the results will be compiled and it will be sent to all the owners and say, hey, this vote passed with this amount of percentage voting yes for the vote or against the vote. And then, we help execute these decisions. So if you want to list it for sale, and the next step is to put the owners in contact with a real estate agent to get some appraisals and some ideas of how much it could be listed for. We'll basically take that decision and go to a real estate agent and say, hey, here's what the owners want to do. Can you help us do this? And that's essentially how these owners and DAOs govern every aspect of the property.
And how about a little bit of the opposite? Let's make the math easy. Mm-hmm. I own the property outright. It's worth $500,000. I'll make it up. It's in Nebraska. Yeah. And I don't quite want to sell 100% outright. Maybe I still want to maintain a level of ownership, 10, 15, 20%. And I like this idea of relatively what's happening in the world of Web3, blockchain, and tokenization. What would that process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So we call that process partial listings at Lofty. And in fact, we do about one of those per week now. So every single week, there's sort of like a mini IPO, if you will, of these partial listings. And there, the idea is really simple. It's exactly as how you described. So it's incredibly flexible. I can give you a real case example. I think it will help illustrate this. So we had one seller come to us, and basically he wanted to actually buy another property. He needed cash for the down payment. And he's, has really high equity in one of his existing properties that's doing quite well. And he just wanted to, pull out a bit of equity to be able to purchase the second property. He went to his bank first, basically his lenders, and said, hey, can I do like a cash out refinance, all that stuff. And they basically said to him, look, we're happy to do it, but this amount is too small. Like if you want to do a cash out refinance, you have to minimally do this amount, or else it's not worth our time to sort of do the underwriting and, like all that stuff. And, interest rates at the time were quite high. So this guy locked in 2.75% 30-year fix. If we were to cash out refi, the new interest rates, I think, would have been closer to like 7, closer to 8% at the time. So he's like, that's crazy. Like, I don't want to take that much out. Like, this makes no sense. I should be able to just cash out essentially like 12% of my equity, like specifically just 12%. So he ended up looking online and found us. And so he came to us, and we basically white glove service and help you through the whole process. And he moved the deed to his property from his existing LLC into a new DAO LLC that's just created for him. So at this point, he's still 100% of the owners. He still owns 100% of the property. We mint all the tokens that basically identify the owners of this property, and we give 100% of the supply over to this person. And then they just list 12% of those tokens for sale on the platform. And then people come, again, they do their diligence, they buy it, and the transaction just go through, and he successfully sold 12% in a actually very short amount of time. I think it was less than a week. And then he got the funds that he can use right away. In terms of governance, though,
yes,
you run you run into what we call, and it automatically adjusts, scale governance, right? So what happens is the majority owners' voting rights are actually scaled down, and the minority owners' voting rights are scaled up to such an extent that the majority owner can't unilaterally do whatever they want, as it's not fair to the other investors and owners in the property. But at the same time, they're still it's still very fair, meaning that if they have most skin in the game, right, they own a huge amount of the property, financially speaking, they have most on the line, they are still given a large number of the voting shares. And so a specific example of this is, let's say you own 90% and you sold 10% of your equity. Well, you will have roughly 53% of the voting rights, right? And remember, it takes 60% supermajority for any decisions to be enacted. And so you, as one person, have 53% of the voting rights, which means, you're still a large holder. You still pretty much have most of the say, but you can't reach supermajority unilaterally on your own. So you cannot just do whatever you want. You have to convince at least some of the other owners to vote with you for you to reach that supermajority. So that's how governance happens for these partial listings.
Got it. And we do encourage our live participants. Part of the value of being live is not just in the moment, and you never know, maybe certain videos don't make it, and certainly some don't to my more public platforms, but also, and maybe more specifically for my members, you get a chance to ask questions. So there is a question that came in. Jerry, how about maintenance? Do I need to contribute, say, 3% if the property is making such a loss?
Yeah, that's a great idea. So I'm not saying this scenario would never happen, but we basically built in a lot of features so that it's very unlikely to happen, right? So every property or every DAO actually has a cash reserve fund that's just sitting in their bank account, and it's called the operating reserve. And so owners actually voted on how to replenish this reserve. So every time there's maintenance or issues, it draws from this cash reserve so that it can, immediately take care of repairs without any of the members contributing personal funds, right? But once you use up some of these funds, how do you replenish it? So owners actually have voted on different mechanisms for different DAOs on how to replenish it. So for the majority of them, if a property's operating reserve is below 100% full, they will throw 50% of the monthly cash flow back into replenishing that reserve until it's full. And then the owners only get 50% of the monthly cash flow. And if the reserve is below 50% full, they'll actually divert 100% of the cash flow into filling the reserve. And the owners will temporarily, for that duration, not receive any cash flow. So that's one mechanism for it to be filled. Another mechanism is when you buy tokens, right, on the secondary market, when you become an owner in a property, you actually pay a 2.5% fee with your order as an operating reserve contribution. So as a new owner, it's not fair that only the older, previous owners contributed, but you don't contribute anything. So when you buy and become an owner, you're basically paying sort of like a one-time fee into this reserve to say, hey, here's my contribution as a new owner. And again, that's another way for these reserves to be topped up to the point where some reserves are actually above 100% full. There are properties with reserves that are close to 200% full. So that means like they can really kind of handle bigger maintenance and defer maintenance issues. And then again, as owners, you can even vote to say like, hey, the reserve's too high now. It's just sitting there doing nothing. Like we want to pay, X percent of this reserve just as a bonus cash flow to the owner. So you're able to do that as well. But that's how maintenance is typically handled. And should the maintenance be so expensive that, the existing operating reserve is not enough to handle it, there's actually a lending feature available on our platform that's open to all of our users. And it's called a lending DAO. So when you buy tokens in this lending DAO, or you're basically buying ownership in this lending DAO, it doesn't actually own any real estate properties. But what this DAO does is it pools money from all these different owners, and it's exclusively there to make loans to other DAOs that need it for some predefined interest rates. And again, the owners will vote on all this stuff. And so most of the properties that don't have enough reserves to handle their own maintenance will typically go to this lending DAO to borrow funds. And then in the future, when they're cash flowing again, they will use the cash flow to pay off this loan. And so those are the mechanisms where, owners use to handle all these maintenance stuff, to the point where the vast majority of time, or today, we've never had to, or I've never seen any of these DAOs do a capital call for each single owner being like, hey, you own 2%, you have to give 2% of this repair bill. That's never happened before.
And Jerry, I know now it's mainly focused on single and very small multifamily homes. How is it going to evolve into CRE, commercial real estate? Is that a next move?
We're starting to have some of those like triple net leases of like, smaller sort of commercial strip malls. I think because of just the open nature of our platform, and it's for everyone, like you don't have to be an accredited investor to use it. I don't think we're ever going to really do large scale commercial developments. Like I don't think you're ever going to see a massive like resort build out, or like, a huge mall renovation or rehab or things like that on the platform. Those are sort of reserved more for institutional players. And for that, if they want to use all the mechanisms, all the, transaction financial rails we built in, all the governance features and record keeping, all that stuff, you can actually do what's called a private listing on Lofty, which is you can bring, properties and things into a DAO, tokenize it, and basically do everything that I've described previously. But the list is actually hidden, so not anyone can buy it. It's only open to maybe buyers you've already found who are other institutional folks, basically whitelisted users. So you could do that as well. But for us, we probably will do only projects that or only listings that can be sort of generally understood by the average person without needing specialized knowledge, right? Because once you get to in real estate, once you go above a certain size, go beyond a certain type of property, you kind of need to have specialized knowledge in that field where the average person just doesn't really understand it anymore. Different tranches of debt, like it can get very complicated very fast. Whereas typically for most single family rentals, like everyone knows what a house is. Everyone knows you can make money by renting it out, whether that's on Airbnb as a short-term rental or as a long-term rental in a traditional sense. And same thing for these smaller commercial real estate projects. It's 5 storefronts in this commercial mall with a parking lot, triple net leases, and you have McDonald's and Domino's as the 2 anchor tenants. Like that's something that's pretty easy to understand too.
And many of you, or some of you in my audience, know that back in the day, early during COVID, in 2020 into 21, I was extremely active, especially on the ultra-conservative family office world, broadly in the world of Web3. Not just interviewing Michael Saylor, which was unique, especially a couple of years ago. Reached out to him. He's potentially going to come back on. He told me this October, November. A part of the quotes from my interview with him made its way into Fox News a year ago, so a little after the fact. But Michael did get some of the hardcore questions. Jerry, you're about to get some of them too.
Sure.
I forgot most of what I may have known back in my hardcore blockchain and NFT days, but I still may have a trick or two up my sleeve. Right before I mention that, because you never know who's watching and listening. There's a lot of smart people, maybe not quite as smart as Jerry, but a lot of smart people in my audience. When I sold my Family Office Association membership group and took a little time off to launch what I'm doing now, I gave consideration a little bit of what Jerry built in the real estate world to build my private club effectively on a Web3 blockchain slash NFT, and how that intertwines really into blockchain platform and allowing the exchange of membership or fractional units to be able to attend an event or some level of exclusivity, and gave some consideration to effectively buying a mansion. I don't know, Miami, Vegas, LA, maybe Jackson Hole, but not enough people want to come there just yet. But we're trying to get Wyoming on the map, maybe New York, maybe Greenwich, and then having that be a hub for members in various tiers. So if there's any really, really smart people out there that have some ideas around that, you know who to reach out to. Just reach out to me. I shelved that idea to do something more classic and traditional, which I'm happy with. It's worked out very well, but always looking around corners and being more cutting edge than most in the community. Somewhere that's in the back of my head, and maybe one or two of you could prompt me to do so. Jerry, and some of my terminology after a couple of years may be a little off, but here we go. Mm-hmm. Explain Lofty's verification process, because I think the only way you could do this on chain is via what's known as soul-bound NFTs in each user's wallet. A soul-bound NFT cannot be transferred. Therefore, how do you get a soul-bound NFT in your Lofty wallet for the blockchain to verify that you're a real user?
Yeah, so being in the space that we're in, obviously we're subject to a lot of regulations. Bless you.
Thank you.
We're subject to a lot of regulations in this space. And so one of them is abiding with, anti-money laundering, any OFAC sanctions and things like that. So to be a user on Lofty, you actually do have to be KYC, right, fully. So when you create an account, you have to enter your personal details, and then you have to actually take a photo of your driver's license or a piece of official ID. and then take a photo of yourself to make sure that, your face matches your ID and matches the information that you've entered, and, your social security number for tax purposes, things like that. So you have to go through that whole process. So we know internally at Lofty, whether you pass the sanction screening or not, right? So we connect to the OFAC database. And so if we know that you pass, we issue one of these non-tradable NFTs into your wallet. So every time you create a new user account on Lofty, there's a new blockchain wallet that is created for you and it's attached to your Lofty account. So you interact and you control that wallet by just using the website, like using the platform, and you don't really need to understand how wallets work. And we issue that NFT into your wallet. And that NFT can never be traded. You can't buy and sell it. It can't be sent to anyone else. And in the future, should you, let's say, hypothetically, fail OFAC sanctions, and now you are a sanctioned individual, we can actually take that NFT back. And so all these smart contracts for trading, buying and selling, for lending, all this stuff that's built around our ecosystem, it looks for this NFT in the wallet. And if it doesn't exist in your wallet, it won't let you interact with the smart contract. So that is basically how we verify and sort of gate people, so that like a random person without this NFT is not able to come and just start interacting with the ecosystem with our users. And this is how we can say to regulators very confidently, like, hey, every single person that is trading, that is buying, selling, and doing activity in our ecosystem, we know that they pass all the required screenings. And should they not in the future, we're able to block them.
And Jerry, I'm almost tempted to go down a deep rabbit hole, but why don't we keep it a little bit superficial?
Sure.
So I'm the one who brought up the Vertiage NFTs. Again, I hinted at a couple of minutes ago. I was very active in that market a couple of years ago. Most of what I did went bad. Some did good. I got out at the right time. I'm afraid of using that word or that acronym, non-fungible tokens, NFT, sometimes because of a perception that people perceive as, oh, that's crap digital art. That is too simplistic. Now, those who feel that way were not theoretically proven incorrect, maybe 99% of the time, but who knows what the future may hold. But I told all of you in the audience that it was going to be far deeper than just so-called verifiable, quote unquote, digital art. It was going to intertwine with what we're seeing in the blockchain, which kind of is what it is, in effectively DAOs through tokenization. In everything that is so-called Web3, NFTs are absolutely not, quote unquote, dead. I'm going to give you the tough task because I didn't really live up to it. If you had to explain the context of an NFT for what you're describing and try to keep it 90 seconds to 2 minutes and why it is valuable moving forward, why?
Yeah, we basically just call it, you don't really even have to use blockchain terminology for this. We just call it a verification back. So again, it verifies that the wallet you're using belongs to a person that has passed all these KYC and screenings, and that's it. And obviously, you don't want that badge to be identical to someone else's badge, right? Because it should be unique to yourself. So sort of like your driver's license is unique to you. It's different from everyone else's driver's license. It's one of one, essentially, right? So that's the exact same concept, and that's typically how we explain it to people.
And let me know where my concept of it may simply be wrong, but are family offices really going to do cross-chain swaps, converting USDC, USDCA to quote unquote get cash? What am I missing and where am I overly complicating matters?
So yeah, we, again, like in principle and from a technology perspective, those things are required. But again, we built a platform in such a way where we have our own on and off ramps, and you just simply don't have to deal with that. It happens automatically for all of our users. Now, if a family office, has their own enterprise account with Coinbase and want to use their Rails instead, you're free to do that. But for the vast majority of users, they will most likely just use the Rails that are already built into Lofty.
And here's a question that rightfully so came in. I was getting to it, audience, but one of you in a text beat me to the punch. And I think it's a fair question. After many advantages that I do see in both you and your platform, That question is, do Lofty users lose, that was his words,
Mhm.
lose the tax benefits of real estate via the DAO LLC, or how does that interact and are K1s issued?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, no, they're not lost. They are actually taxed a multi-member LLC. Again, a DAO LLC is still just an LLC legally speaking. So, multi-member LLCs are basically taxed as partnerships. So they file
So
1065
it's a
forms and
pass
so
through.
forth. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And so you benefit from all the depreciation expense, all the operating expenses that you traditionally get from real estate. So most of our users are either on paper, at least not showing any tax liability, or in many cases have negative tax liability, which they can then use to offset income, or capital gains from another source. Now, for us, having one K1 for each DAO became very cumbersome. Like we had users who own like 100 different properties, and they're like, okay, I'm sick and tired of getting 100 different K1s every single year, and like that's so annoying. I don't want to have to deal with that. And it's so expensive with my CPAs as well. So we worked with a firm and basically created this, it's basically like accounting wizardry, but the DAOs still file the 1065 forms, informational returns on their own, and it's still passed through. But instead of multiple K1s, our users now get a single, they get two forms. They get a 1099 div, so 1099 dividend form, and a 1099B form as well, if they did any tradings and had capital gains or losses. So this makes it much easier for you to own a very large portfolio and still really, at the end of each year, only deal with two basically tax records.
And what are, I mean, in some ways, I guess, who knows what the future may hold, but on the surface, what are some of the regulatory risks for in tokenized real estate?
Yeah, I think the key piece really comes down to management, which is why we've been so intentional about what we do and how we do it, like what Lofty is responsible for, what we're not responsible for. Owners basically control every aspect of the business and the properties themselves. And it basically comes down to the regulations around securities laws and securities offerings and things like that are still not very clear in this space.
True.
On paper, we're fine. All of our users are fine. These are not securities, which is why we're able to allow non-accredited investors to buy into these tokens and ownership. And the reason they're not securities is because it goes to the raw definition of security, which from previous rulings and laws that have come out basically says that, look, if you have a group of people, doing some sort of joint venture or putting their capital at risk, but they have 100% control of that venture, of that entity, of that investment, then it's not a security, right? And so that's essentially what's happening here, where you choose which properties you want to buy and invest in. There's no index, there's no fund, no one manages this for you. You vote. Every single owner has the legal right to vote and propose what to do with their assets and investments. And no matter how a property performs or it doesn't perform, that is all up to the owner, like how you guys manage it, how people decide to operate them. And so, we as an entity, as a business, we're just there to build the technology, the platform, so that you can, trade real estate instantly as if they are stocks, and bring that liquidity to the market and a better user experience. But we don't actually control any of your assets. We don't own any of the assets. And we don't dictate how they're managed. So that's kind of why we went this route. But again, it would be really nice to see regulatory clarity in this area.
And maybe related, you kind of answered, I think I know the answer, but is Lofty selling, if that's the right word, these tokens retail via Reg CF or Regulation A?
No, these are just, again, we don't sell or buy anything. So when you buy tokens, you're not buying them from us. So you're just basically doing private transactions between groups of people for private LLCs, essentially.
If someone lost, you probably answered it to some degree in the NFT question, but if someone lost their LP, let's go with that word for now, tokens, they cannot reclaim their deposited assets. How many users are acting, and maybe I'm not using the right words here, but as LPs?
So So I guess in this case, losing access is obviously not great in the traditional sort of blockchain and Web3 space. But for us, again, because these are LLCs and you have full control of them, we've had this happen actually, where, one or some owners lost access to their wallet or they got hacked or whatever is the case. And they actually can make a proposal and, we can certify these proposals of like, hey, we verify the facts and check the details, where they basically go to their fellow owners and say, would you guys be willing to reissue tokens, right? That's something that DAO is able to do. It can actually, redeem and reissue tokens anytime it wants to. So the other owners will turn in their existing tokens and be issued new ones. And then when the new ones are issued, the original owner can be reissued their pro rata portion of what they actually legally own. So really, if someone were to hack your account and take your tokens, there wouldn't be any use for them. They wouldn't be able to interact with our platform, and you just essentially get new tokens back at some point. And so it's a really safe way for traditional real estate investors.
And Jerry, what's the current activities relative to if I'm non-US international, both potentially as a buyer or a seller?
Yeah, so seller is tough because, again, we understand the regulations both around real estate and securities laws much better here in the US. We're a US-based company. So, we trust in the system, like how we do everything, these, signing for agreements using your wallet on the blockchain. All of these things are, so far, at least to my knowledge, only proven out in US courts. So we have the confidence to say, hey, this legally all makes sense, and you guys can have the confidence to do this. If you were to try to sell a property in this exact same way, with this exact same mechanism in, let's say, the UK or France or something like that, most likely it still would work, but we can't guarantee that. So that's why we haven't really listed or allowed any international properties to be listed. But if you're an investor, it's perfectly, again, if you pass sanctions screening, it is perfectly legal for a foreign investor to buy real estate in the US. And so we absolutely have users from all around the world that are, partial owners in these properties.
Excellent. And a little bit of context to the audience. As you could tell, I may have just a little bit, by family office standards, of fluidity in the topic. Maybe not quite as much as I had 3 or 4 years ago because I'm not quite as active in it. But I think that is something that's different from those that are more vanilla, down the middle, and really have fallen behind, which is many people, sadly, in the family office world. A little bit like when I spoke to Jerry earlier about you got to adapt, you got to iterate, you got to change, you got to see around corners, because if you're really staying level, you're not. People are passing you, you're falling behind, you're really going like that. So it is important to update your skill set. And one of the advantages that members of my organization get is my fluidity and my connectivity in that space, in private gatherings, in private introductions, even to people like Jerry and others. So simply go to angelorobles.com and learn more. Imperfect, of course, as always, but in terms of staying ahead of the curve and seeing around corners, I mean, honestly, as an organization, I think we're miles and miles ahead of the competition. I had a chance to connect with Jerry's partner first, Max, great guy, got a chance to learn about the company. I'll definitely be doing something in there. Not quite sure what, but I've developed a relationship with them. And I would recommend, as I give Jerry the chance in a second to share how many of you can learn more, to reach out and note that, hey, Jerry, I heard you on Angelo's program, Angelo's podcast at Family Office TV. There may be some additional resources and benefits perhaps that you'll get, and the opportunity, especially if you're a bit of a larger, more non-retail, but more quasi-institutional or family office investor. And there may be certain things that I may want to be more active and allocate as well in. Now, all that being said, do understand in anything, when you invest, you need to understand your risk profile, your time horizon, and the fact that when you invest, you could lose money. Again, when you invest, you could lose money. Perspectives and conditions change. Right now, it's late September of 2024. Who knows what the future may hold? And at the end of the day, bringing back the before mentioned Michael Saylor, when I asked him from his MIT experience what was the number one value in his 4 years that he got out of it, he must have waited about a tenth of a second. And then he said to think for myself. So at the end of the day, do your own due diligence and think for yourself. But on that note, I wanted to kick it off to you, Jerry, to give either broadly a synopsis close and how people could reach out to you, Max, and learn more. And maybe if they're a bit larger than a traditional retail investor, maybe a private email to you and Max, or theoretically, I can make the intro if they want to come to me. But if they wanted to reach out to you or Max more personally, again, please, audience, be respectful of their time. But on that note, I'll give it to you to do a close.
Absolutely. Yeah. So look, I understand because of just everything that's happened over the last few years, blockchain and crypto kind of has a pretty negative connotation in the institutional space. But really, I would just view this as another technology. It's like the internet, right? There are frauds and scams on the internet all the time, but I think the vast majority of us conduct our day-to-day work now on the internet as well. And so, to us, blockchain is just another technology that happens to be useful for what we do. And at the end of the day, we're basically trying to build the NASDAQ for real estate. We're trying to build the world's first real estate exchange. And our vision for the future is that at some point in the future, we just won't do these sort of over-the-counter traditional paperwork related real estate transactions anymore. Everyone will just be able to plug into an exchange just like they do with stocks and say, hey, I like that company, I like that stock, and you'll just be able to buy it there. And you'll have a much more transparent price discovery mechanism because you have millions of people trading and interacting with the price in the market to really sort of get to what the market clearing price is, which unfortunately real estate lacks. But it also will greatly increase liquidity so that truly, if you want to, depends on what price you want to sell it at, but if you choose the right price, you should be able to sell any real estate asset instantaneously in the future. And that's our goal and that's our vision. In the meantime, we're really proud of what we built already. We believe it's already by far 10 times better than the traditional real estate experience for anyone that's gone through it. And one of the things that kind of support this is pretty much every single one of our users, the ones that do the majority of transactions on the platform, if they're a seller, they typically will have sold multiple properties with us. And that's sort of their preferred way to go now. They just won't sell real estate in the traditional way anymore. And for buyers, for investors that buy tokens, they'll often come and tell us unsolicited, just over email randomly, that unless there's a property that they really like, that's just outside the platform. So in that case, they're just going to buy it the traditional way. But if there's a property that they like that's on Lofty, they will always choose to buy it through our platform just because the process is so much easier and more enjoyable for them. So this is something, a lot of people are still talking about theoretically, like what does tokenization look like? What does RWA and all of this stuff looks like? And even to a certain extent, BlackRock is talking about it like it's this thing hypothetically in the future, 5 to 10 years away. The truth is we've been operating for the last 4 years now, and our growth has only continued and will grow at an even faster pace. So this already exists. This is real. If you want to do it today, you absolutely can.
And Jerry, for those that would like to learn more, and again, specifically, they're a bit of a larger scale investor, how could they learn more and reach out to you and or Max?
Yeah, so you can just go to our website, and if you want to, there's Learn Center, there's all these materials for you to read and understand how things work. And you can just sign up self-serve directly from the website. But if you want to ask us any questions, feel free to just email us directly at info@lofty.ai. So that's info at our domain name, lofty.ai. And we'll get back to, one of us will get back to you. We love talking to our users, so don't actually worry about bothering us. Literally, if you have 1,000 questions, email me 1,000 times. I'll get back to you. So rest assured, that's not an issue on our end. Even today, we have over, I think, 135 properties now on our exchange, quote unquote. And they have a combined worth about close to $40 million for our market cap now for all these different properties. And that market has done over $60 million in transaction volume. And our largest user has actually done over 2.1 million in terms of in dollars of transactional volume to date. So definitely the market is available for people that want to have higher ticket sizes. So it's something that if you want to talk about custom fees, because we make our revenue, we don't take a cut of any of our users' income or returns. We purely make our revenue through trading fees. So if you're buying and selling, you pay us a fee on the transaction. If you don't trade, then you don't pay us anything. Everything else is free. And so, for some of our larger users, if they want custom pricing, like, hey, I'm going to commit to X million of dollars of orders each month. In exchange, I want a much discounted rate. That's something that can be negotiated as well.
Of course. And again, Jerry and Max have been nothing but amazing. Their customer service is excellent. Definitely have a chance to reach out either through the website forum. Again, I would recommend mentioning, hey, the Angelo Robles podcast, or that family office guy, the family office guy with the beard, whatever you want to call me. And this may be more specifically if it's one of my members or what could be deemed to be a larger scale relationship. Feel free to email them, mention that directly, or especially if you're a member, or even if not, I just want to do the right thing. Feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to make the intro. Again, do your own diligence, make your own decisions, but I think what they're doing is intriguing. I called this years ago. Maybe my timeline, I admit, was a little off, but I'm definitely great to see that they've actually been doing this for a couple of years. It's just getting more and more scale and attention currently at the moment. So everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. Make sure to go to YouTube, both at Family Office, that's my baby, and at Family Office TV, and subscribe. I'm on Rumble, I'm on Apple and Spotify. So if you're more of a car person and prefer to listen and not be distracted visually, that works. Although not all my content is up on there. I'm also rather active on LinkedIn, but really the majority of time is focused on value added to my members. So feel free to go to angelorobles.com and join my membership club, SFO Continuity, and be a part of some of the greatest investors and family offices on earth, from multiple contents, my experience, my proprietary content, and literally private digital and in person, over 100 programs every year, and occasionally some like last year in Europe. So not everything is only in quote unquote North America. So I look forward to it. It's been a very busy season and time. I hope you enjoyed my discussion today with Jerry Chu. I enjoyed it greatly. Look forward to the next time. Jerry, again, thanks for being a great guest. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. Thank you.